Welcome to the Filmcast review of Dune Part 2. I'm going to read the plot summary from the internet. Paul Atreides unites with Chani and the and the Fremen while seeking revenge against the conspirators who destroyed his family. Facing a choice between the love of his life and the fate of the universe, he must prevent a terrible future only he can foresee. End quote. Joining us for this conversation about Dune Part 2, one of my favorite people working in Hollywood right now.
Woo!
You've seen his movies like Cube and Splice. He's also worked on television shows like Hannibal and The Peripheral. He also has a new graphic novel out right now called Tech, I believe, right? Vincenzo Natali, welcome to the Filmcast.
This is so lovely to be back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. Vincenzo, tell us about this graphic novel, Tech. I'm glad you chose to focus on an extremely narrow subject matter for your first graphic novel, Tech.
Yes. Why not start flogging some swag, right? This is Tech.
Nice.
It's a graphic novel that I wrote and illustrated. And, it's just an expression of my frustration as a failed comic book artist. And it was a lot of fun. And what can I tell you? I mean, it's got a foreword by William Gibson, who is
wow, that's cool.
Somebody I'm a great fan of and have stolen from liberally. Yes, please seek it out. It's on Amazon and all the usual places that you find graphic novels and books.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, Dune Part 2, one of the biggest movie events of the year. Vincenzo Natali, why don't you tell us briefly about your relationship with the Dune franchise and what your thoughts were on Dune Part 1? And then would love to hear overall what you thought of Dune Part 2, which you just watched last night, so you could be here on the Filmcast today, right?
Yeah, I'm still processing it a little bit. But, I'm of a certain vintage. So I saw David Lynch's Dune in the theater.
Wow.
Way back when. Which was probably one of the most disappointing experiences I've ever had in a cinema in my life.
Wow.
Because I was really, if you were to put yourself back at that time, it really was expected to be the next big film event. And I had, at the age of 10, seen The Elephant Man, which really profoundly affected me. And then a number of years after that, discovered Eraserhead, which also affected me profoundly, not understanding or knowing that it was the same director. And then when I connected those two dots, I was a full David Lynch fan. So the prospect of Dune became very exciting to me. And I believe I read the book in advance of seeing the film, which was the last time I read a Dune book. That was a long time ago, but which I enjoyed. And but the movie was it's actually aged much better. But in the moment, if you had been with me at the time when I walked out of the theater, I was angry, angry in the way that you can only be when an artist that you dearly love disappoints you.
We know that feeling, yeah.
And we've all had that.
Yeah.
So, but there's a resonance to the movie, which of course partly comes from the book. And I think, I've returned to it over the years, and I actually, especially after seeing the Villeneuve first Dune film, I started to appreciate that movie because actually they're kind of quite similar. They're more similar than you might expect. And you begin to realize actually how much David Lynch got right in that adaptation. And there's just, so much lore associated with the making of that film. And then, of course, there are the books themselves and how they've infiltrated the popular consciousness and, the genre in general, which is in a very deep way. I mean, starting with Star Wars is obviously deeply indebted to Dune. And I think it's interesting, seeing part 2, thinking about Star Wars and thinking about the prequels and how, even the prequels probably owe a debt to Dune. So, it is this massive cultural artifact of science fiction that that's why it's good to have a podcast, because there's a lot to talk about and dissect. And that is, brief history for me with it.
So your overall thought,
Like, I'm not a, I didn't read the other books. I don't have a passion for the Frank Herbert novels like some people obviously do.
So what were your overall thoughts on Dune 2? What was your big reaction coming out of Dune 2?
Great. Yeah, it's good. It's really good. I think it's, I'm sure everyone is saying that right now, so I feel like I don't have anything to contribute. But the first part I liked very much, but I was cognizant of the fact that it's only part of, it's very hard to do just half a book because it does feel incomplete. And so I think the second film benefits from being able to finish the novel and kind of, you're kind of past all the exposition and all the hard work that you have to do as a reader or as a viewer to get to that point. And now you kind of get to ride the worm, as it were, and have a good time. And I love Denis Villeneuve's work, everything he's done. I think he's quite brilliant. And I feel like his approach to science fiction and this movie is what the genre needs now. I mean, above and beyond, it is an experience as a movie. I think in a broader sense, I think it's important. I mean, really, say what you will about Hollywood, and it's really not been a great time. This film could not have been made in the past, like 20, and obviously when David Lynch did it 40 years ago. I think that is on the positive side of the spectrum where the medium has evolved to. Like a movie of that sophistication and of that cost and scope in the realm of science fiction can now be made and treated with great seriousness that it deserves. And I don't think there was the cultural environment for that even 20 years ago, certainly not 40 years ago when David Lynch did his Dune. I don't think, even though that was a big budget movie, I think part of the reason the film didn't work out is because, the producers didn't understand it. But now, I think because of where Denis Villeneuve is in his career but also I think where the culture and the culture of Hollywood is at right now, that thing can exist. So that's great. So I think it's a really heartening experience. Sorry, I'm just eating up all the air here.
No worries. Don't worry. We have plenty of time.
Yeah.
But here, let's pause for a moment and let's hear from Devindra Hardawar. What was your reaction to watching Dune 2?
It's pretty good. Pretty good movie. I'm right there with you, Vincenzo. Like, my thinking was like around Star Wars at this point, because I've also been like, I've liked a lot of the TV shows, but I've also been like just kind of sad about how empty some of it has started to feel, and has started to feel like made for TV sci-fi, and it feels like that's a watering down of like what we loved about the scope and the epicness of Star Wars. Watching this movie, it just feels like Villeneuve is like like he had this all in his head. He's just like ready to go right where we left off in the first movie. And this movie is just so big. Like there's just so much going on. It is a wild ride all the way through. It does feel like the second half of a book. So yeah, we're straight into action. We're straight into like really whole new characters who are all of a sudden very important, like Florence Pugh's character. But it just feels like there's so much going on. And it kind of reminds me, I saw this right before, kind of in between. I was rewatching Dune 1 like in between all this, but watching this and then going back to Dune 1 just feels like, oh wow, he did actually have a lot of this just in his head at that point. So the sheer scope of this thing, the way it feels so immersive and lived in and real, just like the first movie, I think it's incredible. Also, this may just be an experience like a few people have, but I saw this thing in an AMC Dolby Cinema. And these things are unique because this is filmed in IMAX, so IMAX is like the best possible way to see it. But that's where my press screening was, and they have dual laser Dolby Vision projectors. They have Atmos sound, and they also have transducers in the seat, which rumble the seats. And I'm not usually a fan of that, but by the time Paul was like riding the sandworm, which is in the trailer, we know that's going to happen. Everything was shaking. My whole body was shaking. Like, this whole experience was like, it felt like the most immersive thing I've ever seen. I went to like ran out to go use the bathroom in like a quiet part, and like my body was just vibrating. It's like when you go
if you have a kidney stone, go see Dune 2.
Right out. Get right out. But it's like when you get a really good massage, and just like for the rest of the day, you're just like, oh, my body is just like moving with all of this. Like, my body was in Dune. It was in Arrakis, even like leaving the theater. That's a good thing about that theater, experience. But I think that's all part and parcel. Like the sound design, the music, everything like immerses you and puts you in this world. This movie is almost 3 hours long. And I was like, I need more. I could have sat there for 2 hours more, to be in this. So yeah, I freaking loved it.
Jeff Kanata, I'm so curious. What did you think of Dune Part 2?
Well, Dave, I guess you could say what I thought about Dune Part 2 is best summed up in the form of a limerick.
You know, I'm not sure if Vincenzo is familiar with this ritual that we do.
I am. I listen to you guys. I know.
Okay.
Oh, good. Well, it's not something I would want to put you through, but Dave is a monster, and he requires a limerick every episode, or he has told us all that he will walk. So I wouldn't do it. When guests come here, I'm embarrassed for him, really. But here's my limerick for Dune Part 2. There's so many beautiful things that Villeneuve's artistry brings, and this generation gets an adaptation as perfect as Lord of the Rings.
Wow. All right.
I do think this is comparable on the scale of genre adaptation, of classic fulfillment of what you might want as a fan of a literary work, as Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings was. I don't think the first Dune movie, Part 1, feels as satisfying as Fellowship of the Ring, for example, but we talked about that last time. We're talking about the sequel. The sequel does, to me, hit all the notes I want. It is interesting to see how it really tries to reckon with something that is as outdated as the Dune novel is, written in the 60s, I think. A lot of this movie's changes to the text are an attempt to kind of reckon with a lot of positions it takes that I think we've progressed past. And I think it's really interesting to see how it does that. And a lot of, I think, the things that Dune as a literary work inspired. We've already talked about Star Wars, and so much of genre storytelling has been inspired by Dune. I'm on my book club show. We're talking about the Malazan Books of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson, and he has been very explicit that Dune was the major influence, and there's so much that has influenced it, and so to have that body of references all in our heads, all of the things that we've seen that were inspired by this thing, and then to come in and make a new version of the thing, the danger is that it will feel like a retread, it is mining ground that we have already seen over and over. And I think Villeneuve,
I would say an example of that is like the John Carter movie. I don't know if you remember that, but that's a property that inspired so many things, and then the movie comes out and it feels like
tired and stale and it's like, oh, another one of these. It's like, no, it was the first of these. So I think that's a real challenge with Dune, because you have these tropes that are so well worn. This chosen one, all that stuff, secret magic powers and ancestry that is revealed and all that stuff. And I think it's Villeneuve's skill and ability to sort of dazzle with the way that the story is presented and the visuals of it that masks a lot of that. But I think the script does a lot of heavy lifting too, to kind of put emphasis on other things and acknowledge that we have a different perspective on some of that stuff now. And so a lot of the changes, and we'll get to that in spoilers, but a lot of the changes I think are really interesting in how the voice of doubt is put into this movie, where I don't think it really existed in the novel, to my recollection. But I think just the pure spectacle of this is worth seeing it alone. Just the visual and auditory experience of being inside this movie. We've already talked about how it shakes your bones and dazzles your eyes. That is enough to justify the price of admission. But I do think this sequel fulfills the story in a way that the first didn't for me. And it really is so satisfying. Those big beats, those big action moments, it is a very, I think, crowd pleasing movie as well. There are moments of thrilling action and thrilling, payoffs of things that have been set up in that first movie. So I absolutely loved it as well. And I think it is interesting because it is a clunky story in a lot of ways, I think, to modern audiences, but I didn't feel like it was clunky. I feel like it really rectified that in a lot of smart ways. And the performances are awesome. The sound is amazing. I love the score. I just had a great time with Dune Part 2.
Yeah. I agree with most of everything you guys have said. I specifically what Jeff Kanata said at the end. This is a movie you need to go see in a theater.
Yep.
It honestly
in
reminds
IMAX
me,
if you can.
in one of in an IMAX if you can, and ideally in one of the, I think, 30 screens in the world that have true IMAX. Jeff Kanata, we talked last year about Oppenheimer and how that was a massive movie event. I remember at my local IMAX theater, which had true IMAX, when I went to go see Oppenheimer, that was the 22nd screening in a row that was sold out of Oppenheimer, right?
Yeah.
And people really
hungry for Oppie.
journeyed. They they took days off. They traveled to go see Oppenheimer in IMAX.
See giant people in a room talking.
Right, and that's the thing is yes, that movie is visually very interesting, but it's not an action movie. It didn't feel like it really took full advantage of the
scale,
the audio visual scale that you can have. I'm not saying that it didn't take advantage of it at all. Obviously, I'm being 100% serious here. Seeing Cillian Murphy's face 3 stories tall. That does change the experience of watching Oppenheimer in a way that makes it more compelling. So no sarcasm there. I'm 100% earnest. But this is the IMAX experience I think we think of when we think of an IMAX experience. Devindra mentioned the scale, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. There's so many times when you see human figures, and in the background is either endless dunes of sand, waves of sand, or these massive hulking machines. And you just get a sense of how tiny these people are and how small they are in this huge world that's been created. A person riding a sandworm. This is in the trailer, right? It's you just see how insignificant and small people are, but then how big the scale of the objects and the settings that this movie is thinking in, right?
And you also feel like that as an audience member. It's fun to feel like a little ant.
And if you see a big screen, you feel like I'm freaking tiny in front of I cower in awe of what I'm witnessing. It is an audio visual spectacle for the ages. As we're recording this, we don't know how well the movie is going to do. But I hope that it does. By all accounts, it's going to do better than the first movie. I think that's awesome. I think it's going to be great for theatrical film going. I think it's going to inspire a whole generation of artists. This movie, these first 2 movies of the Dune franchise. So overall, it's if not a home run, at the very least a triple. It's really compelling stuff, and why we go to movies. It's a new sci-fi classic. Really enjoyed the movie. Having said all that, I do think that this movie buckles under the weight of trying to do a little bit too much stuff. The first movie felt so elegant in all the stuff that it excluded from the movie. We don't need an explanation for how spice works, and we don't need an explanation for how space travel works and all this other stuff. And this movie feels like it's buckling under the weight of all the new characters that it's trying to include. Most of the characters from the first movie, spoiler for the first movie, died, right? And so there's a whole new cast of characters that's introduced, all new ideas here. The movie's 2 hours and 45 minutes long. I'm going to say I don't think it was long enough, right? I think we needed a whole other hour to really learn more about these characters.
If only there was a book you could read.
Indeed. But
not the same.
But I think at the end of the day, right, there's big character moments where I think to myself, I'm supposed to feel this way about what this character is going through at this time, when I just don't feel like I have the buildup that's necessary for that payoff to happen. So I'm a little bit mixed on the storytelling, the plot and the storytelling.
Sure.
And then, of course, right after that, Denis Villeneuve gives an interview where he says, I don't think dialogue is that important in movies. And I'm like, this makes complete sense. And that sums up why the movie is both amazing and also in some respects not great, because visually it's one of the best things I've seen in my whole entire life, right? But from a dialogue storytelling perspective, it's a little bit rough around the edges. So those are my thoughts.
I kind of fall to him, like, is the thing. Like, I do think, like, sometimes we're so plot heavy, right? Or we're so like plot observant that I feel like a lot of storytelling is about feeling and emotion. I think what he is doing is painting a broad epic picture at times, and that does mean a lot of the character level moments may kind of miss at times, but I don't know, it just kind of worked for me. The question I have for all of you, though, is what did you think of Christopher Walken? Because I feel like he may be I love the man, I love him so much, but I feel like, as you know, the emperor of the galaxy at this point, or he's a major leader, right. I felt he was a little too distracting, because he's bringing the Christopher Walken to me. But did he not distract you guys?
I didn't have an issue with that. I think it was more just like he has probably, I don't know, 20 lines in the whole movie, you know?
Sure.
And so it's kind of falls into the thing I said about like not having enough time with these characters. But I think thought he was
like Oscar Isaac in the first movie, who is not in it for very long, but I think makes a huge impact.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, if Walken himself is not distracting, would somebody have done better in that short amount of time?
I think I see what you're talking about. Like, he's not one of the most memorable parts of the movie for me. But all that said, Vincenzo Natali, let's go back to you. I am curious if you have any reaction to anything we've said so far about Dune Part 2, or
I heartily agree with everything. As a filmmaker, I would, and as someone who's kind of, not on the nearly the level of Dune, but who's dipped his toes into these kinds of things, I want to draw attention to one of the things I really like about Villeneuve's approach to world building, or his approach to science fiction. I mean, probably everything he does, but in particular science fiction, he does a kind of minimalist maximism.
Maximalism.
And there's a temptation in doing science fiction to like crowd the frame with a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And he's not afraid of simplicity and emptiness in terms of the visual design. And a
lot of negative space.
A lot of negative space, a lot of graphical kind of set design and composition that is really sophisticated and elegant. And, you see that in Blade Runner, you see it in The Arrival, and you really see it in this part of Dune. I mean, I loved Getty Prime. Like, I just wanted to stay on Getty Prime. Personally,
I
could have spent another hour there. It was great.
That's such an awesome observation, and I think it's a really good point. I love that this world is sort of devoid of screens. There's no screens in this world.
Or if there are screens, they're like analog screen. They're like,
we can't get too digital.
They look like they're from the 80s or something. Like that.
It's a really cool art directed movie. The everything feels really thought through, but also doesn't look like any other sci-fi thing I've ever seen. They found a new place to go with it, which is really cool.
Which is very difficult to do, by the way, because so much has been already done so well. And I also feel like with this one, maybe because of the story he was telling, but also probably because the first one was a success, he was allowed to be a little more eccentric. I think there was a very cruel thing that Alexander Jodorowsky said about the first part of Dune, or at least the trailer for the first part of Dune. And for anyone who doesn't know, Jodorowsky was supposed to direct Dune very famously.
Yeah.
And there's a whole documentary about that, which is, by the way, one of my favorite documentaries, period, but especially about the making of a movie that I highly recommend, called Jodorowsky's Dune. Anyway, but he said it's industrial filmmaking. and which I think was unfair, but I do see his point in that when he was approaching Dune, he was coming at it such a creative way, like, so I think from what I could discern, untethered from the book, like trying to take it further and somewhere else and inject his own imagination into it. Whereas when we got the first part of Dune, it was magnificent, but it was very much within the boundaries of what's expected. It didn't try anything terribly daring in terms of how it approached the material. It just did it really, really well. This one, I felt like he was flexing a little bit, and Villeneuve was flexing a little bit and allowing himself to, use his imagination and show us things that we haven't seen before. So I really, that was thrilling for me.
Before I get to spoilers, Vincenzo, I am wondering if there's anything in the movie, other than the use of negative space and composition, is there anything else that you as a filmmaker thought to yourself, wow, that must have been difficult to do, in this movie? That
Everything. I mean, the other thing I appreciate, and I'm sorry, I'm going to knock James Cameron a little bit and some other directors of his generation.
Commit the king. Okay.
All
and
right.
I have the highest respect for him, by the way. And I even enjoyed Avatar too. But I really prefer being in a real environment. I don't, as beautiful as Avatar 2 is, and that I cried watching that movie, not because of the movie, but I cried for the animators in that movie because I could see how painful, like how many hours, how much work went into it. So I don't want to denigrate it, but give me a real desert. And I feel like this movie, just as you guys were saying, feels lived in. Like I feel like I'm in a real world. It feels, for all of its, eccentric, wild imagery, it actually feels kind of anthropological and real. And I believe this play, partially because, it is just, as the Dune books do, is sort of riffing off of conflict in the Middle East and a lot of things that are real. So I appreciate that. Like, I love the fact that he goes to a real location and that when there are visual effects, they don't look like visual effects to me.
Yeah.
And that's where, to answer your question, that's where I'm like, I don't know. I don't know how he did the anti-gravity stuff. Doesn't look like wires to me.
Yeah.
But also doesn't look like these are digital people.
Right.
So I don't know. I think it's really impressive.
Right. Like that. And that, as a filmmaker, often when you're watching stuff, you could probably think, oh, like this is the kind of camera and lens he used and so on. But like for this movie, you're watching stuff, you don't even know how it was achieved. Right. Like, and that's the magic of a Dune part.
I thought it was lovely. And that's like my picadillo. Like when I see visual effects that don't look good to me, it ruins everything for me. I have a hard time seeing past that. But there's not a moment in this, honestly, not a moment where I felt that. I think it was DNEG who was the main vendor for it. I don't know, but it looked, I thought like a lot of this must be models. Like it doesn't look, before the movie, they had a trailer for, Kong and Godzilla.
Kong v Godzilla or something.
Kong X Godzilla.
Yeah.
By the way, it looks fun. Like I'm not knocking that movie, but that looks very digital.
Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire is the name of it.
Right. It's again, I don't want to knock it. It looks like fun. If I were a kid, I'd love it. But it looks totally digital. Like it doesn't look. Yeah. There's nothing in that looks, and it's partially intentional, probably stylized. But Dune, it really is. It looks like they built those things. Yeah. However they did it. Like it looks like a physical thing, not something in a hard drive from a computer.
Even the sandworms. Yeah. Yeah.
I think in our Dune Part 1 After Dark, I talked about how I think Denis Villeneuve is one of the directors that is best able to combine practical and CG, and he knows where to go practical and where to go CG, and there's all these little details that just sell it, and that you might not even notice. Dune Part 1, when they're first flying into Arrakis, the city, in the ornithopters, right? And you see this whole city unfold, and it looks like maybe they built a miniature, whatever. And as the ornithopters are flying in, first of all, the camera simulates what a camera would be like if you were actually flying in a helicopter. But then out of the city, there's like random buildings that have this little steam coming out of them. And it's just like, just a little touch. You might not even notice it, but it kind of sells it as a real place. And that's true of so many things in this movie as well, where it's not like big flashy, like, hey, this is a real physical. It's like, just like kind of like, oh yeah, there would be steam coming out of some, or smoke coming out of some things or whatever, And I think he's just able to nail those little details that make it feel real. So anyway, any other thoughts before we get to spoilers? There's a lot more to discuss here though.
I just want to say that
yeah,
Javier Bardem is the coolest MFer who ever walked the earth.
So good. He's so good.
Yeah. The dude just can't.
They addressed his accent too, which I thought was smart.
I just love that, like, he's kind of goofy in this movie,
and
he can't not be cool. Like, it's impossible for him not to be. I mean, No Country for Old Men, put him in the worst haircut that any human has ever had. He's still the coolest MFer that ever walked the earth. Like, that dude just exudes cool. Anyway, I just wanted to
He's
say
so good. Again,
Love him.
one of my leads for maybe Doctor Doom at some point.
He'd
Like,
be
I
so
think he would
good.
be perfect.
Yeah.
Austin Butler, by the way, I think great as Phaedra. Like it. I don't know who's the next person whose voice he will steal. But right now he's still Stellan Skarsgård's voice. Like, oh, I'm your offspring. I will just do your voice. I will
I've
do
just
you.
never seen anyone do really a Stellan Skarsgård impression before, right? And he's kind
That's
of like
off to you, Austin Butler.
Yeah, he's in. I don't think Dave Bautista even tried, right? Like,
Oh no.
So he just
Dave
he's
Bautista shot an entire movie, and then it was like, oh, I could have been doing this the whole time.
I also, well, we will talk about some of this, but Dave Bautista in this movie I think is kind of hilarious because he is just like, he is like a little worm after a certain point. Like he's just constantly failing. But yeah. Spoilers.
All right, let's get the spoilers for Dune Part 2 starting right now. All right, let's talk about spoilers for Dune Part 2. I mean, right off the bat, we got to say one of the most impressive parts of this movie, I think, is like for me, the first hour and 15 minutes of this movie were awesome. I mean, it's the part of the movie that we've seen many times in movies like Avatar or, Dances with Wolves or whatever. It's like, it's the white dude integrating with the society that he's trying to be part of. But it is really thrilling. He's learning their ways. And then, of course, it culminates with him riding the sandworm. And that whole sequence was incredible.
Incredible.
Like, that is the thing that blew, that basically the seat transducers were just like going off fire for like 30 minutes. I was just like riding that worm with him. It's amazing.
It's true, man. And even in the Limax that I saw with the sound was rumbling. That sequence is incredible.
We've seen people riding a sandworm in Dune Part 1. We saw what's her name, Liet Kynes, I think, try to ride a sandworm. It didn't work out.
That movie kept really yanking out the sandworming from us, right? She was getting ready. She was getting ready to ride.
Yeah,
stabbed
she
in
gets
the back.
murdered.
Doing a lot of sandworm edging in Dune Part 1, right?
Then we see somebody off in the distance riding a sandworm.
Yeah. And then Dune Part 2 happens, and it's like, okay, they're finally going to show. Finally, they're going to show it happening.
Yes.
And I'm like, how are they going to do this in a way that's actually adds something to what we know about
it also
the
doesn't look super silly. Like the idea of riding a worm, a desert worm, inherently a little silly. Somehow he made it work. Yeah.
And the way, I'll throw out a few tools, cinematic tools that they use to do this. First of all, we talked in the first part of the review about how, it shows him, tiny guy, standing on this massive, sand dune, and then like this massive sandworm off in the distance. Everyone's has great Spielberg-esque reactions of, oh my God,
big.
Not that big. That's too big.
Well, the running parallel to such a great shot.
So cool. And then, he gets on and he tries to jump on and it's like just chaos. Like he can't see anything at all. It's just sand everywhere. He can't see it. He finally gets on and there is texture to this sandworm thing. Like he has hooks on and you see where the hook goes into the sandworm and it pulls up and you see like the little holes on the side of the worm. All these little details just sell it.
The only thing that's funny about that to me is that later when Mom's palanquin is on that, I'm like, did they go through that to get Mom and the team on there?
It's like Uber on Arrakis. Like I gotta call a sandworm.
That's rough, man.
Yeah,
I've been in some shady Ubers before, but that's.
But anyway, that's probably one of the biggest highlights of the movie, right?
Yeah, it's so good.
Riding the sand, all the sandworm stuff.
Dude,
really cool.
there's so many highlights in the movie.
Yes,
all of
absolutely.
the sort of rebels against the empire, terrorist, destruction of the
like the
temple,
Well, the machines,
all the mining equipment,
things,
I can't.
Oh yeah, that part was. But the best scene from the first movie and the best scene from this movie both had to do with spice mining, right? It's like when Chani takes the bazooka or whatever,
turns and shoots the dude, and he goes flying across the screen. Incredible, and just like the methodology, their tactics on how they take down these things, and they gotta the orthocopter has a shield, so you got it has a shield as well. So they can't have the shield up when they're shooting, so you got to take that down. And the lasers through the things from way far away, and just thrilling.
One of my favorite touches from the movie is when she launches the surface to air missile or whatever, or whatever it's called, RPG, whatever it's called, and then it hits the thing, and then you see her like booking it. She's just running,
Yeah.
and there's complete silence. It just is silence, and you hear her like the steps,
Yeah.
and you hear her breathing heavily, and then boom, it like hits the ground, and massive explosion behind her. And that's kind of Negative Space, the audio version, Vincenzo.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
there's just he knows how to use silence.
He does it
too.
twice.
Yeah.
He
What
does
was
it,
the-
he
what was the
does it
other
when
time?
Josh Brolin is walking across the desert. Same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You can't resist. But it's great.
Yeah,
It's great.
Well,
so badass.
that first sequence too, where they go underneath the thing as it's
Yeah,
crumpling
fantastic.
across the, just thrilling, and you really see that, that gritty. They're overwhelming odds, but they've got that, that ability to be the thorn in the side of the giant. They're David versus Goliath. It's so good.
Yeah,
So good.
I am curious, like how some of these other sort of plot elements worked for you, because for me, I was so engrossed in this whole Paul journey, and then the movie just kind of grinds to a halt to like introduce Fade Routha for me. Fade Routha, very compelling guy, and like all this stuff, fighting in the Coliseum and stuff. But
I do love her Florence Pugh's like reaction to that. Fade Routha, he's psychotic. The way she says it is just like, that's everything. That's everything you need to know about this dude. Yeah.
But and then we kind of get wrapped up in all this kind of more Game of Thrones-esque stuff, which is
then it's like a buddy sitcom between him and Dave Bautista's character. Dave Bautista who keeps fucking up, and Fade Routha who's like, buddy, come on, I'm gonna take over because you're a mess. You can't find this guy. Yeah.
The Dave Bautista stuff felt a little bit like a missed opportunity to me, I have to say. Because there's something really compelling about a badass guy like Dave Bautista who can't succeed. He keeps trying and keeps failing, and there's something really tragic to that. And I feel like when that character eventually is killed, I should feel like, oh, like that's sad that he died. But like, yes, it's badass that Gurney Halleck finally gets his revenge for the horrifying massacre we saw in the first movie. But it just felt so quick and perfunctory to me, and it kind of is emblematic of some of the flaws I saw in this film. But what did you guys think? Like, how did the Dave Bautista character work?
I mean, I can agree. I would have listened more Bautista in everything. Like, I will never say no to Bautista. Bautista also talks about Villeneuve as being the first director who's like, you're good at this. You were a good actor, and that made him feel so great in Blade Runner, because Bautista has that amazing opening sequence. I agree. Could have had more. I could have had more of a lot of things in this movie. That's just kind of the way it is. We should talk about how weird it is that they're talking to Paul's sister while she's in the womb. That whole thing, how they even sell it, like early on, you're just like, oh, this is a shot of a baby in the womb. Oh yeah, she's pregnant. That's a character now. That's a character who's speaking through the mother. That is weird. That's so wild. Yeah.
I mean, it's way weirder in the book.
I'm sure.
Because she's like born in the timeline that's covered in the movie. In the book,
boy,
she's like toddler who knows everything. Very odd. But before we get off the Bautista thing, I love that sequence where he's all Sturm und Drang, fiery, gonna bring hell down on them. Gets there, and then they all attack him. He's like, "Well, let's get out of here. Let's get out. Everybody out of here.
Peace."
And he gets saved by like the skin of his like. He gets saved because one of his underlings like manages to save his ass. And
like seeing a dude the size and intensity of him like scared out of his wits was very cool.
That's an inherently interesting thing to watch. So I agree with you there. But anyway, the Florence Pugh stuff, it was another thing where I'm like, I feel like I don't really know this character. By the end of the movie, there's this really amazing. I thought the ending was actually quite compelling. The last like 20 minutes or so, where she kind of. Paul talks in the first movie about how he's going to marry the emperor's daughter and bring, triumph over the other houses and bring paradise to Arrakis. That's kind of what my sense is of what his goal is. But it will require a lot of dead bodies on the way. And and Florence Pugh kind of interjects at the end. She's like, "Hey, I will go I will be your bride peacefully if you just spare my father." And but it's like I don't have any access to that character's interiority. I don't think.
I mean, because we're all in Paul, and Paul spends most of the movie being like, "I don't want to do this. I'm rejecting these visions that I'm seeing because billions of people will die. I think that's a really interesting conflict for a character like him. It's sort of like if Anakin Skywalker had the premonitions of like what he would become, what he would end up choosing to do. That's kind of where we're at here. Yeah.
I agree. The Paul stuff is the most interesting part of the movie for me.
But I would have liked to see, listen, more Florence Pugh, more everybody. Make this like a thing that I'm just sitting in the theater for 6 hours for, please.
Well, I think the character of Chani is very interesting. Zendaya's character in the movie is I think one of the biggest changes to the text. And I think really kind of reveals our modern sensibilities, which is like, hey, the chosen one getting all the power, maybe is not a great thing. Maybe we should, like maybe everybody falling in line and deciding this guy is going to waltz into our society and be the greatest one of us ever. Not such a good idea. Like none of that's in the book. Like she is she's on team Muad'Dib wholeheartedly in the novels. And I think that's a really strong choice for a modern film to do, to have that voice of doubt of like, is everybody seeing this? Like, let's not do this.
This is weird, but also she loves him too. So it's like, I do like the guy, but let's be careful here.
I gotta say their relationship was the emotional core of the movie for me, and it did work. There's this amazing, I mean, I gotta say, for Paul to make the moves he made, I don't think he didn't soften the ground for any of those decisions. Okay, like the very end of the movie, he says,
gave her a heads up.
I will love you as long as I breathe, and then he literally turns around and he's like, "All right, Emperor's daughter, we're getting married," and then she's just
those aren't mutually exclusive sentences.
There's this shock on her face that's really well done. Vincenzo, what did you think of the central Paul Chani relationship in Dune Part 2?
Well, you brought up a lot of things that were very interesting to me.
Hit them all in succession.
So I liked it, but if I have a bone to pick with the movie, it's in this film, and maybe it was something I missed, but I wasn't quite charting his decisions. Like I felt like you were saying, Devindra, I wanted more of the movie, like more time to follow that thought process, because he was so clearly not wanting to go down that road. And then somewhere, and I missed it, and maybe it's there, but it went past me then, because he decided to go for it. And all of a sudden he's in the, he's there with like the big council or whatever. And he's angry. Like he's out there saying, I'm the one. And he's, I don't know how he got there. I think felt it's like something that was missing, actually pulled out of the film.
Yeah, I think it happens around the time when he drinks the sandworm blue juice.
That's what pushes him. It was like, you got to do your thing, got to fulfill your destiny, man.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of a plot cheat a little bit, I think. But I do think it's really cool how they show the sandworm blue juice being extracted. There's a whole scene,
dude. That chick in the shallow water, like pulling the thing out. That's another one of those of like, how much of that's CG? How much of that is a puppet? That's so cool.
Yeah.
And there's a cruelty to the movie that I appreciate. Like, I think that what the hope always was for Dune in all of its filmic and television incarnations is, well, this is going to be Star Wars for adults. Like, this is going to be, your adult space opera as opposed to your kiddie space opera. And I do feel like it fulfills that promise, because there are shades of gray, and there is a kind of brutality that feels real. That isn't sugar-coated. And so the Fremen, they kill a goddamn worm. I felt sorry for the worm. And she's happy, whatever, the priestess, whoever does it is, delighted. Like, she feels no compassion for the worm whatsoever, even though she's sucking the juice out of it and drowning it in water. And I like that because it feels authentic.
Yeah.
I was reminded
the whole
of you,
Bene
Vincenzo.
Gesserit perspective is like pretty dark.
It's super dark.
They're just using everybody as pawns. They're playing the long game. It's very cruel, as you said. I think that's. I was a little
confused by the whole plan to be like, okay, we need another pawn just in case this Paul thing doesn't work out. Like, we just gonna.
So they Gom Jabbar Fade Rotha in the movie.
Yeah,
which is a sentence that I now understand what it means. But yeah, they put him through the Gom Jabbar, and that's
like, why are you Gom Jabbarring yourself? Why are you Gom Jabbarring yourself?
I want to bring up the worm sequence, by the way, the baby worm. That was a very Vincenzo sequence. Like I had some Splice vibes there, Vincenzo. So I was like, oh, I was kind of wondering like what you would think of this movie.
If this is a TV show, Vincenzo would have directed the baby worm sequence. He would have been chosen to direct the baby worm sequence of this.
I felt for the baby worm. That's the only moment that I felt like crying in the movie.
Oh wow! Because that's the character you related most with.
I related most with him. It was so cruel. She was so sweet to him, and then she just drowned it in water. It was horrible.
She just wants to swim.
But I think there's. I'm sorry. I feel like there's a little bit of Paul missing in there. I like Timothée Chalamet a lot, but I know how other people feel about this. I do find him to be a bit affected. Like that whole whispery thing, like he's whispering all the time. And I don't find him terribly charismatic, to be honest. I don't know. I think it's a hard part to play. I think Paul is very not terribly nuanced as a character, as just that's the nature of the character. But that I would have loved to have like seen a little more of his journey carved into the story, and it felt sometimes a bit Cole's Notesy, where we got from one place to another with him.
I'll just say that Timothée Chalamet really pleasantly surprised me in this film. So I actually had the opposite reaction, where maybe before going into this movie, I wouldn't have believed that Timothée Chalamet could get up in front of, let's say, 5,000 people and give a really rousing speech and get everyone on board and to follow him as a leader. And I thought he knocked that one out of the park. I got some chills. I got some chills in that scene, and of course, there's also like a darker aspect to that scene, that becomes clear by the end of the film.
It does feel like it really sells the glory of fascism to you, doesn't it? It's like, oh, you're probably going to die for whatever my galactic mission is, but you're going to feel it's going to be exciting. You're going to have fun. We're going to have a party. He really sells it.
I don't even know if I describe it as fascism. I think it's more of like as they put it at the end, like a holy war, the religious zealotry of it, right? Like
that's a big part. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the same as it feels like a different thing than fascism a little bit, but it has a different flavor.
It's still being controlled by power and using that power to kill billions. It seems
it's fascism after you win the holy war.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, correct. But anyway,
I loved the choreography of that final storming of the Emperor's chamber, where you have all those badass dudes who are like, "Okay, here we go, let's go." And they leave, and you hear nothing, and then there's just here comes Muad'Dib and his bros, and then they just completely ignore the Emperor, and he just walks up, murders the Baron, and is like, "Okay, that's what I came for." That's such a cool. Like I've never seen it played quite like that, and I thought that was such a neat way of handling it.
It's a great way to not have to shoot an intricate action sequence.
Well, I think it sells the potency of what's happening. Like these are the coolest dudes the Emperor has to fight, and there was no problem at all. You
don't hear the fight, you don't see it. Like they're so powerful.
Right.
These guys are just
they just waltz right through.
Yeah,
so cool.
Yeah,
and the Emperor is such a non-threat that they can just ignore him. It's the coolest. Yeah,
NBD Emperor. Yeah, but I do think that to Vincenzo's point, I do think like Paul's motivations at the end were a little bit like he finds out he's a Harkonnen, and it's like, what is the impact of that? And then he kills his grandfather, and then he kills his cousin, I want to say, at the end, and it's like, what is his reaction to any of those things? I don't feel like I really get where his head's
he's
at
a little like
that,
spice frenzied at that point, or like frenzied by like the blue thing that he drank because his eyes got super blue. So how much of that is him, and how much of that is like the prophecy kind of propelling him forward too? I don't know.
What did you guys think of the fact that both this movie and the last movie have some of the most large-scale fight sequences, action scenes ever, and both movies choose to end with Paul in a one-on-one fight?
Love it.
More. That's cool. I'm curious. I mean, they're both good fights. I think they're both like they both have compelling things about them. But I just think it's an interesting choice. Vincenzo, what are your thoughts on the? You haven't really made action movies per se, as far as I can recall. But I'm curious, like what you think about the idea of like ending with something small after having done so many big things.
Well, I think the first thing you said or early on was, Denis Villeneuve's so good with scale.
Yeah.
So part of scale is knowing when to go big and wide. Have a wide perspective and show the little person next to the giant worm.
Yeah.
And then the other part of scale is to know when to be very intimate. And I think one of the big problems with action movies or superhero movies these days is they just stay in this scale that's so massive that you stop relating to it. And what he does very effectively, and I do think it's from the book, is with that last fight. It's a mano-mano knife fight, and you feel that much more than you would when an army is being crushed by a sandworm. Like, it's so visceral and intimate. I think he handles all that kind of thing beautifully, and I think it's important. I think that's like one of the big lessons with these epics is that there has to be some kind of balance, where you pay homage to the size of what you're dealing with, the awesomeness of what you're dealing with, and yet somehow contextualize it on this very human level.
So Denis Villeneuve has said that if this movie works out, he's going to make a Dune Part 3, and that will be the final film of the franchise, right?
We'll do the next 6 books in one movie.
Is that true? I thought it was just going to be Dune Messiah, right?
I was joking. I was totally joking.
Right. I guess I don't want to speculate on the plot of that movie because a lot of people haven't read and I don't want to spoil it for them. But I guess I am curious, like, where this movie leaves you emotionally, because here's the thing, Jeff, you could argue the same thing that you argued about the first movie, which is that
I don't agree.
Okay,
I don't agree with that.
This movie does leave on a bit of a cliffhanger. Let's put it that way, right? Like, it does leave like, hey, some massive thing is about to start, and then the movie just ends. But Jeff, go ahead. What was your reaction to the end of this?
I think for me, the end of the first movie is literally an ellipses, right? It's ... And the end of this one is there's another chapter to this story. I think there's a distinction between those two. I think this has a climax, a conclusion, a new place that everyone has arrived. I mean, you could argue that people are in a new place at the end of the first film, but the place is a question mark, and the question mark here, I think, comes as you are with a lot of stories, like, well, what comes next, rather than how does this end? I think the first movie is, how does this thing end? We know what happened. I feel like our main antagonists have been vanquished. Our hero has achieved something. There is more to tell, but not in the same way at the end of the first film, where it literally is nothing has been resolved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually get a conclusion to a story, which I think is kind of key about this one. But I do agree. I'm kind of left the same way. I'm like, more Dune. More Dune, please. Now I need more Dune.
But the thing, it would suck if the third one never got made after watching this.
It would.
I think it would. But Vincenzo, any thoughts on where this one ends?
No, I mean, it's the end of the book. Everything's as it should be, but I think that unlike the David Lynch one, you see where it is a little more Star Wars-y, actually, in that the good guys win, and it actually rains on Arrakis, which is in fact a bad thing because that would kill all the sandworms. But it's supposed to make us feel good. This movie ends with Paul, from as far as I'm concerned, making a wrong choice. Like, he's going down a bad road.
Yeah,
he betrayed his one true love for this goal, which could be for the betterment.
But it does feel incomplete to me if we don't get the third part. I'll just
you can't. Yeah. No, it's not done. No, it feels like Empire Strikes Back or something. Like, it feels like we're in the we're end of Act 2, not the end of, even though it's the end of the first book, technically speaking.
Just not the end of the story.
Well, I was just going to echo what Vincenzo said about it being sort of the adult Star Wars. I remember reading Dune as a young person, I don't know, 13, 14, when I was super into sci-fi. I was reading Asimov and Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. And I was absolutely in love with Star Wars, and I didn't enjoy Dune because it didn't scratch that little kid fantasy. It was this darker subversion of that idea. And so it was never among my favorite books as a kid. I didn't read further into the series. I was like, oh, this feels icky. But I love that, as an adult, I'm able to appreciate that, but also that the films are embracing that about it, right? They're not trying to turn it into,
Right.
kind of as Lynch did, trying to turn it into a more commercial idea.
Yeah.
I do want to say it's kind of baller just to be like, hey, Anya Taylor-Joy's in our movie. A little bit.
For
Maybe she'll be more in the next
8
one.
seconds.
For like
Yeah.
8 seconds. But again, honestly, like Shawnee was kind of like similar in the first one too. Like it was mostly visions and she wasn't actually featured until the end. But this is just like, who else can do that?
Some Marvel shit is what that is.
Yeah,
That's Marvel shit.
It is Marvel stuff, but it's very much like, well, it's a character you've never met before. Also, you're talking to her as a baby in the womb. That is weird. It clearly has her own goals and machinations involved too. Like this baby seems devious. I just think that's fascinating. Like that he can just do that because it seems like it breaks the rules of a lot of movie, storytelling.
In the book, she's the one that kills the Baron, not him.
Interesting.
But
interesting.
Yeah, later.
All right. Shall we wrap it up there? Before we go, Vincenzo Natali, tell people where they can find more of your work on the internet or elsewhere this week.
I think I'm at Vincenzo_Natali on, I refuse to call X, on Twitter, at Vincenzo_Natali. And then I'm on Instagram at, forgive me, Vincenzopoulos.
Love it.
That's cool.
Which I probably could not even spell if you asked me to.
And be sure to check out Vincenzo's graphic novel Tech, which is out and available for purchase. Vincenzo, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, guys. So great to see you. And
also, at the end of the day, it is extremely impressive that Denis Villeneuve made a movie. So, congrats.
Congrats.
All right. Thank you so much for watching this video of the Filmcast. Check out these other videos that we have available, and be sure to hit like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to get other videos from us in the future.
You can also go to thefilmcast.com to catch all of our audio podcast versions of all of our episodes.
And support this podcast at patreon.com/filmpodcast, where you can sign up for ad-free episodes and exclusive After Darks.
Thanks so much to everyone who makes the Filmcast possible.